What if Africa's mightiest army marched without rifles, waged no battles yet shattered every shackle still clinging to this land? In the blazing heart of Ouagadougou, 60,000 sons and daughters rise not with weapons, but with history pulsing in their veins and tomorrow burning in their grasp. They are the hidden legion forged by Ibrahim Traore to guard something greater than borders, the very soul of a people. If a nation encircled by threats can lift 60,000 guardians of the spirit, what remains as an excuse for those who dwell in safety yet choose silence? Tell me where you are watching from and subscribe, not for amusement, but to stand with a continent whose hour has arrived. The sun had barely lifted above the red rooftops of Ouagadougou when the first drum beats began to speak. Their deep, ancient rhythm rolled across the parade ground like a heartbeat carried forward from centuries past. 60,000 graduates stood in formation, rows upon rows, stretching far beyond the horizon, their faces lit by the newborn light, their breathing steady and synchronized as if sharing one vast set of lungs. There were no rifles resting on their shoulders, only the invisible weight of a promise about to be forged in the air between them. At the front, Ibrahim Traore did not stand apart, separated by barriers or a polished podium. He stood among them, boots sunk in the same dust, the heat of the morning on his brow, his voice cutting through without the need for a microphone. He spoke of a time when children in this land were made to bow before foreign flags, when the tongues of their ancestors were silenced in the name of a false civilization, and when the young were taught they were born to serve, never to rule. He told them that before they ever drew breath, the world had already written their roles, and that today was the day they would tear up that script and write their own. The air was thick with heat, with memory, with the quiet electricity of history about to turn a page. In the eyes of those gathered, you could see whole generations reflected, fathers and mothers bent over in fields burned by strangers, rivers stolen by companies that had never seen their banks' villages emptied to feed the greed of empires across the sea. Many in this crowd were children of farmers, traders, and market women. Some were the very first in their family to wear a graduation sash. A few had once fled across the desert on blistered feet to escape the violence in the north, only to return now wearing the uniform of hope itself. Then the moment came. Traore lifted his right hand, and in perfect unison, 60,000 hands rose into the dawn. The oath was not read from paper, nor dictated from above. It was spoken the way a prayer is passed down in the blood, older than memory. I will never betray my country. I will serve with integrity. I will protect my people with my life. The words surged outward like a tide rolling over the ground, until it felt as though even the earth beneath them was speaking. If you are watching this and believe that these voices are the answer to the prayers whispered by those who came before, write Amen in the comments. Let your voice cross oceans, slip through wires and screens until it joins theirs. Because oaths like this do not belong solely to the lips that shape them, they belong to everyone who dares to carry them in their heart. The drums struck again harder now, and I saw tears on the weathered cheeks of men who had fought in wars long past and had believed they would never live to see a day like this. I saw women clutching faded photographs of children who would never return, their faces lit not with grief's shadow, but with the fire of something reborn. And I understood this was not merely an oath to a flag, nor to any government. It was a covenant made with the soil, with the rivers, with the trees, and with the children still waiting to be born. Traore's eyes swept the sea of faces, steady and unblinking. You are not here to follow, he said. You are here to lead. To lead in your homes, in your villages, in your classrooms, in your markets. The enemy will not always arrive with guns. Sometimes they will arrive with gifts, with papers to sign, with honeyed words meant to rot your spirit. When that day comes, remember this day. The roar that rose in answer was not chaotic. It was one voice made of 60,000 throats, echoing beyond the parade ground, beyond the city walls. It was not the sound of youth waiting for orders. It was the sound of youth who already knew their path. As the sun climbed higher and burned gold upon their faces, it struck me that what had unfolded here was not the formation of an army, but the awakening of a continent's will. Yet even this was just the beginning. An oath is like a seed, and even the most sacred seed must be nurtured before it becomes a harvest. The question that lingered was whether these 60,000 seeds planted in the dust of a small West African nation could grow strong enough to break every chain that still binds us. Perhaps the answer lay in the stories they would now carry back to every corner of the land, stories etched in blood and sacrifice, and in the unshaken will of those who had walked before them. Stories that would be told in classrooms, sung in the fields, whispered on crowded buses, and shared in the stillness of nights under skies heavy with stars. And those stories, more than any weapon forged in steel, would decide what Africa would become when the battles ahead were over. From this field of dust and dreams, the road now bent backward into the long shadows of history, to the roots where this oath had been waiting long before any of these young guardians were born. The fire burned low in the courtyard, its embers glowing like tiny suns in the cool breath of night. Smoke drifted upward in slow, deliberate curls, as if carrying messages from another century to the stars. Around it sat a tight circle of the newly sworn graduates, their shadows dancing across the packed earth eyes, fixed on the figure at the center, an old man whose hands were dark, weathered, and calloused from decades in the fields. His name was Boubacar, and in his voice lay the weight of both mourning and victory. He had lived through a Burkina Faso that was not yet Burkina Faso, a land chained under another name, another flag, another master's will. He spoke of a time when foreign soldiers patrolled the markets like owners, when the best grain was seized and loaded onto ships bound for faraway shores, and when the people were told their earth, their rivers, even their breath belonged to someone else. We were made to labor. He said, not for our children, but for men who did not know our names. We were told our stories did not matter, but every story matters when it is written in blood. The graduates leaned closer. They had read about colonization in sterile paragraphs and faded photographs, but here beneath the fire's flickering light, those facts bled into flesh. Boubacar told them of uprisings born in whispers, a farmer who refused to hand over his harvest, a mother who hid her children when the recruiters came for forced labor, a village that pounded the drums all night so the enemy could not hear the fighters moving in the dark. He spoke not only of Burkina Faso, but of Mali and Niger, where rivers carried not just water, but the memory of blood spilled for the dream of freedom. He spoke of nights when men from 3 nations clasped hands under the moon, swearing to stand as one even if their borders were ripped apart by strangers sitting in distant palaces. They cut us into pieces on their maps, Boubacar said, but they could not cut the bloodline that binds us. The young listeners felt the truth pressing down on them. They could almost see those rough colonial maps drawn by hands that had never felt the soil slicing through villages, forcing cousins into different countries, planting the seeds of future wars. They could hear the sharp crack of rifles on the wind, the urgent rustle of bare feet running through tall grass in the dark. Then came the moment that silenced even the fire. Boubacar's voice dropped, drawing them in. "Do you know who you are?" he asked, his eyes scanning the ring of faces. "Half of you, half of the 60,000, were once orphans or had no work, no place. The world would have left you to vanish in its forgotten corners. But here you are chosen, not because you were born with everything, but because you were born with nothing and still found the courage to rise." The words fell into their hearts like stones into a still pond, sending ripples of heat and urgency through every chest. In that instant, the day's ceremony shed its formality. The graduates ceased to be merely a force in uniform. They became living proof that destiny could be wrestled away from the grip of history. If you are hearing this and have ever felt abandoned by your leaders, by your homeland, or by your own time, ask yourself, what would you do if someone placed in your hands the chance to rewrite not just your life, but the fate of your people? Would you take it, or would you let it slip away because the chains seemed too heavy to break? Boubacar turned his gaze back to the fire, as if searching for the eyes of those long gone. "We fought," he said softly, "not because we thought victory was certain, but because we could not bear to kneel. And that, my children, is why you are here, to finish what they could not." Far off, the drums from the morning's oath still echoed faintly, their pulse weaving itself into the crackle of the flames. The faces in the firelight looked older now, their innocence worn away by the inheritance of both triumph and unfinished struggle. One of the graduates' voice, barely above a whisper, asked grandfather, "Did you ever think we would see this day?" Boubacar smiled, the deep lines of his face folding into something fierce. "I dreamed of it," he said, "but dreams alone are not enough. You must guard them like you guard your life. The world will come for them. It always does." His tone sharpened like a blade. "The chains may not clink like they once did. Now they come as debt, as contracts, as sweet-tongued lies meant to hollow you from within. You must learn to see them, to name them, and to break them, or they will bind you just the same. When the fire finally sank into glowing embers, the graduates rose without a word, carrying Boubacar's voice alongside their oath deep inside the place where resolve lives. Above Ouagadougou, the night sky spread wide and unbroken, but every heart there knew that beyond its reach, forces were already moving to test them. The dawn ahead would not bring the lessons of history alone. It would bring the battlefield of the present, where the weapons were invisible, but the cost of losing would be just as deadly. The mornings in the training camp began before even the first blush of light dared to touch the horizon. In that deep blue hour before dawn, the graduates would gather in the courtyard, shoulders brushing breath, rising in pale clouds into the cool air. From one corner, the soft murmur of a call to prayer would rise and fade, while in another hands rested firmly over hearts as the national anthem swelled. The anthem was not sung from routine. Each syllable was a quiet act of rebellion, each note a declaration that this land could never truly belong to anyone but its own people. Breakfast was humble yet grounding, thick millet porridge, fresh water pulled from the well before sunrise, and on rare mornings a piece of sweet bread if the kitchen could stretch its supplies. They sat shoulder to shoulder on worn wooden benches, knees pressed together, voices low as they exchanged reflections on the lessons from the day before. Laughter often broke through, the kind of laughter that belonged only to those who understood that the world outside still wished them silent, yet could not take their joy. By mid-morning, the real work began. These were not classrooms of rote recitation and lifeless chalkboard notes. Here every lesson was a weapon sharpened for the mind and a shield built for the soul. One session taught them to read the news, not to parrot headlines, but to find the fingerprints hidden behind each story, to see when truth had been bent to fit an agenda. Another explored history, but told in the words of the conquered, not the conqueror's stories, where the heroes were farmers, market women, and nameless fighters who refused to kneel. Then came the lessons on the chains that still linger, modern ones, forged not of iron, but of paper and numbers, debt trade deals, the smiling tyranny of international finance. In one workshop, an instructor turned to the blackboard and wrote 3 letters IMF. Beneath them, he drew the curve of a shackle. These, he said, tapping the chalk against the board, are the chains you cannot see, but they will weigh you down all the same. The World Bank may greet you with a smile, but its handshake can cost your children their future. You must learn to tell the difference between a partner and a master. They studied the subtler weapons as well: misinformation, psychological warfare, the slow erosion of self-belief. They were taught not only how to resist these forces themselves, but how to stand before their communities and shield others from them. And yet life in the camp was not only discipline and defense. Between sessions, small clusters of students would gather under the wide shade of acacia trees, trading fried plantain, roasted groundnuts, or tales of home. It was there I met Musa Tall, with the calm, steady gaze of a man twice his age. He told me his first earnings, not from soldiering but from teaching, would be sent to his mother in the countryside. She carried water for miles so I could study, he said quietly. Now I will carry her burdens in return. In that single promise was a vision for the continent's future that no speech could match. If 60,000 young men and women like Musa lived in your country, what would they change first? Would they rebuild the schools that crumbled? Would they guard the rivers and mines so they could never again be stolen? Would they tear up the debts that strangled generations? Or would they walk into every classroom, every market, every parliament, and teach each child to stand taller than the chains meant to break them? If you believe in the power of a generation rooted in discipline, truth, and love for their people, share this story. Let the image of these mornings in Burkina Faso travel beyond our borders into the homes of all who dream of freedom. As the weeks passed, the transformation became visible to the eye and unmistakable to the heart. The hesitant shuffling of their first days gave way to a confident, measured stride. Their eyes no longer searched for permission. They looked straight ahead with an unyielding focus. They spoke of their future, not in the tentative language of if, but in the assured rhythm of when. They knew the traps the enemy would set, they knew the roots of their history, and they felt the full weight of the oath they had sworn. But training the mind and guarding the soul was never the final destination. It was the foundation, the steel frame upon which every future action would be built. The real test would not unfold within the safe embrace of these camp walls. It would come in the unpredictable chaos of the outside world, in crowded classrooms, bustling markets, tense parliament halls, and in the quiet spaces where true leaders are forged. And so, as the last days of immersion drew near, the conversations began to shift. They were no longer about holding the line. They were about stepping beyond it, about leading the millions still waiting in silence or in struggle for their own chance to rise. The story of the 60,000 did not stay locked within the camp's walls for long. Within mere weeks, photographs and short video clips began to surface, not by accident, but with careful intention. Western newspapers ran them under cautious, almost clinical headlines. Burkina Faso's youth program raises questions. The phrase youth program seemed harmless enough, but the tone beneath it was anything but. In television studios, analysts leaned forward in their chairs, lowering their voices as they speculated about what Ibrahim Traore was really building. Some called it a bold new model of civic duty. Others whispered about indoctrination. At the United Nations, a handful of smaller African delegations spoke up in support, but most remained silent, their words trapped between private admiration and public caution. Embassies in Ouagadougou sent back encrypted reports heavy with speculation. Who exactly were these young people? What would they do once their training ended? And why was the program expanding at such a rapid pace? In Bamako, Mali's leaders sent an official letter of congratulations, hailing the 60,000 as a living shield for the dignity of our continent. Niger's interim government went even further, proposing an unprecedented joint exchange where young people from all three nations would train together in the coming year. The proposal lit a spark across Pan-African networks online. Images of graduates marching in perfect formation, sunlight catching the gold in their uniforms, were paired with captions that read, "The future is united." But not all messages carried goodwill. The very week Niger's letter arrived, a shadowy online campaign began to spread across social media. Edited clips surfaced, the oath stripped of its words about protecting the people replaced with unrelated footage of armed groups carefully spliced to create the illusion of militarization. A few major news outlets picked it up without checking sources, and soon the phrase paramilitary youth began to circulate in hushed tones. Inside the camp, the instructors made these distortions a lesson. Look closely, they told the graduates. This is how they will come for you. Not always with armies, but with words. Not always with truth, but with stories sharpened to cut the truth apart. The young men and women leaned in their faces, lit by both anger and understanding. They knew now that the battlefield was larger than they had imagined. Then, in the middle of a strategy session, Traore himself stepped into the courtyard with a revelation that froze the air. The funding for the entire program, every bowl of millet porridge, every uniform, every instructor's wages, every book in their hands had not come from foreign donors or from squeezing new taxes from the poor. It had come from a single radical decision. The government had cut a major portion of the national defense procurement budget. "We chose to build people instead of buying weapons," Traore said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "We chose to strengthen minds rather than stockpile bullets, because a weapon in the hands of the unprepared is more dangerous than no weapon at all." It was the second great shock of their training. Some graduates exchanged stunned glances, not because they doubted the decision, but because they understood the courage it demanded. In a region ringed by threats, no leader willingly shrinks the military budget. And yet here stood one who had done precisely that, wagering the nation's future on the discipline and conscience of its citizens. If you are watching this now, ask yourself, why does the world fear young people who carry no guns? Why is a mind trained to see through lies deemed more dangerous than a soldier with a rifle? And what would your country look like if its leaders chose to invest in people instead of in war? That night, the camp gathered in the open field under a vault of stars, scattered like ancestral footprints across the dark. A quiet prayer circle formed. Some bowed their heads, others lifted their faces skyward. Verses from the Bible and the Quran were spoken in turn, their words weaving together in a single fabric of hope. They prayed for wisdom, for courage, for the unshakable strength to stand when tested. And when the final amen drifted into the night, it felt as if the air itself was charged, as if those who had walked these lands long before were leaning close to listen. From the ridge above the camp, you could see the faint orange glow of the capital city in the distance. Beyond that lay the invisible borders and the brittle ambitions that still cut the continent into pieces. But here within this circle of 60,000 steady breaths, those lines meant nothing. The day was coming when they would no longer be students inside the shelter of the camp, but living testaments to a choice that defied the logic of power as the world had always understood it. That day was closer than anyone, even they, could fully imagine. The final morning arrived without ceremony, yet the air itself seemed to hum with anticipation. The parade ground, once a place where oaths were sworn and truths hammered into memory, was now a river of purposeful movement as 60,000 graduates prepared to step into the world beyond the walls. Their uniforms were still sharp, but the faces above them had been transformed. The hesitance that once lived in their eyes was gone. In its place was a steady, unflinching gaze, the kind born from seeing through the fog of deception and choosing a path with no shortcuts. Families had traveled from far corners of the country, some arriving the night before, laying mats on the hard ground outside the gates. There were embraces so fierce they seemed to compress years of longing into seconds. Mothers cupped their children's faces as if committing them to memory anew, while fathers stood a little taller beside sons and daughters they knew would never return as the same people who had left. When the gates finally opened, the 60,000 poured outward, scattering like seeds flung by the wind across the map of Burkina Faso. Some boarded buses that would carry them to remote hamlets where the roads end. Others began the long walk to nearby towns, their steps measured but certain. Within hours, they would be teachers in classrooms whose cracked walls still bore the stains of old rains, engineers plotting wells in drought-worn fields, farmers returning with new techniques to heal exhausted soil, and journalists ready to ask questions no one had dared to ask in decades. In the village of Tenkodogo, a small team arrived by midday. They found children playing barefoot in the dust, many of whom had never held a book. Without waiting for permission or direction, they gathered the children beneath the largest mango tree in the square. With chalk in hand and a weathered board borrowed from the local school, they began tracing the alphabet. A girl in a faded red dress knelt to draw her first letter in the dirt, with her finger, her grin wide enough to swallow the sunlit afternoon. One of the graduates leaned toward me and whispered, "This is how chains are broken, one word at a time." Similar stories began to ripple back to the capital. In Bobo Dioulasso, a young man had opened a night class for adults eager to learn to read and write. In Kaya, a woman was teaching farmers new methods to protect their soil and increase harvests. In Wahiguya, graduates were holding weekly gatherings to teach neighbors how to recognize and resist misinformation. The people soon found a name for what was happening, a name that came not from journalists or officials, but from the graduates themselves: the Sunrise 60K. It was more than a title, it was a declaration that the first light of a new day had already crested the horizon. Before long, the hashtag #Sunrise60K began to spread across social media, each tag paired with a photograph or a short video of graduates in action moments that together formed a growing mosaic of change. If you are hearing this now, ask yourself, what would your own country look like if 60,000 young people returned from months of training, ready not only to work, but to lead? Would they rebuild broken schools? Would they guard the rivers and mines from theft? Would they stand in front of every child and teach them to rise higher than the chains meant to drag them down? Share your thoughts in the comments, because movements are not born in silence. They are built in the open, with voices joining across borders. The transformation was not measured only in the jobs they took or the skills they applied. It was in the way they stood in the marketplace, in the town hall, in the church pew, or during Friday prayers. They listened before they spoke. They questioned without fear. They stood for the truth even when it cut against comfort or convenience. Yet for every small victory, there was an unspoken understanding: this was only the beginning. For every village that opened its arms, there would be another where suspicion lingered like smoke. For every voice they inspired, there would be another determined to drown them out. Still, the current was moving. The Sunrise 60K was no longer confined to the boundaries of a camp or the framework of a single nation's program. It had become an idea, and ideas, once they find enough hearts to live in, cannot be chained again. From the girl tracing letters in the dust to a minister in a distant capital reading reports of rising literacy, the thread ran unbroken. The personal was merging with the political. The quiet acts of daily courage were feeding into a tide that, if it kept rising, could lift an entire continent. And as the first reports reached Ouagadougou of these scattered seeds taking root, one truth rose clear above the noise: the world was not ready for what was coming. But readiness had never been the measure of change, only will. And will was something they had in abundance. What took root inside that camp was never a mere training program. It was the deliberate planting of a long-term liberation strategy, one that would measure its success not in exam scores, diplomas, or job titles, but in the slow, unshakable dismantling of every chain that has kept Africa from standing at its full height. Education by itself can make a person literate, but education braided with discipline, with living history, and with a sense of sacred duty can turn a person into something far more dangerous, not to their own people, but to the systems that have grown rich by keeping them on their knees. The Sunrise 60K are living proof of this truth. They walked out of that camp not simply as graduates, but as sharpened instruments of transformation. The vision behind them, shaped and steered by Ibrahim Traore, rests on a truth every successful freedom movement in history has known: you do not secure a nation with walls or with soldiers alone. You secure it by raising a generation immune to the poison of lies and fearless in the face of power. Already the ripple has crossed borders. In Bamako, students gather before sunrise for their own dawn meetings, inspired by what they've heard. In Niamey, union leaders are discussing whether a similar program could prepare young workers to lead with clarity and courage. In diaspora, communities oceans away, another question has begun to take shape. What if we built our own sunrise? Even now, the headlines under Burkina Faso latest news are written in the measured, hesitant language of outside observers, but you can feel the tone shifting. Once they wrote of this nation as fragile, dependent, defined by the crises it endured. Now they are being forced to write of it as a place that refuses to be defined by anyone else. If you are watching this, I am asking you for one concrete action: share this video with a young person you believe could stand at the front of the next generation. Do not assume they already know these stories. Do not assume someone else has told them that leadership is not something you are handed, it is something you claim with your own hands. And for the next 24 hours, set your profile picture to the red, green, and gold of Burkina Faso. Let the world see the flag and understand that behind it stands not just a government, but a people wide awake. Because here is the truth that the powerful will not say aloud: a citizen who knows their own history is more dangerous to oppression than an army of soldiers. A community that can name its own wounds and still choose to heal together is harder to conquer than any fortress. This is why movements like this unsettle the global order. They cannot be erased with bombs. They cannot be bought with bribes. Ibrahim Traore did not wager a portion of the nation's defense budget on a feel-good experiment. He made a calculated investment in the only force that cannot be disarmed: an army of minds and hearts united by the unshakable knowledge that freedom is their birthright. He did this knowing the world was watching, some with quiet admiration, others with clenched fists of fear. When you next read Burkina Faso latest news, remember, you are not just reading about a small West African nation. You are reading about a test of whether a people can rise not by mimicking the empires that once ruled them, but by creating a model that serves their own future. If this test succeeds, the blueprint will not remain within these borders. It will travel, as all dangerous and beautiful ideas do, to places where the soil is ready and the people are hungry for change. But here is the warning carved into every page of history: every liberation movement has known its hour of triumph and its hour of peril. Victory can make you careless. The enemies of freedom are patient. They wait for fatigue, for division, for the slow crumbling of urgency. And when they sense it, they will move. The question is, will you see them coming, and will you still have the will to stand? That is why this story does not end here. The Sunrise 60K is only the first wave. There are more young people to train, more communities to awaken, more lies to tear apart, more chains to break. If you have listened this far, then you are already a part of it. You are no longer just an observer of Burkina Faso latest news. You are a participant in a continental rising. So I will ask you again, send this to one young person you trust with the future. Change your profile picture to the flag of Burkina Faso for the next 24 hours. Speak these stories aloud around your dinner tables, in your churches and mosques, in classrooms, in marketplaces, in union halls. Because when history looks back, it will not remember those who watched quietly. It will remember those who stood, those who spoke, those who refused to bend. And when that day comes, may your name be counted among those who did not wait for permission to build the Africa we were promised. This is not a conclusion, it is an opening. The next chapter is already being written in village schools, in city streets, in dusty fields, in the minds of children who will grow up knowing that leadership begins the moment you decide to act. And if you listen closely enough, you can already hear it. The voices of 60,000 who have stepped into the light, calling the rest of us to follow.